Hello, guys. Tonight we begin with the extraordinary lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants. The everyday heroes who, despite adversities, managed to survive some of the coldest and brutal nights in history. From improvised tricks to isolate themselves to community strategies for sleep. Their story is one of courage, ingenuity, and determination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I do here. And let me know in the comments from where you watch us and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from different parts of the world. Now, lower the lights, maybe turn on a fan to have a soft background murmur. And let's start tonight's journey together. When you think about medieval life, maybe you imagine nightly justs, great banquets, and cheerful fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was not so cheerful, but rather a struggle for survival. It was not just a season of year. It was a test of endurance that was repeated every year, like an especially cruel teacher who did not believe in second chances. Imagine this. You live in a small mud and stick hut with walls so thin that you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. No insulation, no windows, unless you count a small hole covered with animal skin, and certainly no wars over the thermostat. The indoor temperature of your house was only a couple of degrees above the outside temperature. If it was very cold outside, inside it was a little less cold, out of courtesy. Congratulations. The nights were worst. The darkness enveloped everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the fireplace crackled pitifully, doing its best, but mostly warming the feet of whoever was sitting nearest. If you were on the other side of the room, we're sorry. It was like you were camping outdoors with worse snacks. The clothes were not of much use either. The peasants did not have luxurious fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a pair of coarsely spun wool tunics, maybe a cape that smelled suspiciously of goat, and the hope that by putting them on one after another you would become a kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't work. And forget about snuggling under soft duvets. The beds were nothing more than sacks filled with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes added for comfort, and, as an extra, some fleas to keep you company. Luxury. Your name is medieval life of the peasants. The cold was not only uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Freezing, hypothermia, and death from freezing were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up alive was considered a small miracle and, frankly, deserved to be celebrated, perhaps with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter was not a matter of comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, putting on all the clothes you had, snuggling with the cattle, and praying not to wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows. And the real adventure had just begun. If you think your apartment has drafts because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like to tell you something. Their houses didn't just have drafts. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most of the peasants' houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub constructions. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal manure. Yes, manure. They were not trying to be disgusting. Manure was a cheap, sticky insulator. Besides, it was always easily available, so to speak. These walls, however well smeared they were, did not stand much of a chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and danced merrily in the one-room houses, swirling and making sure you never felt comfortable. Privacy, none. Heat, neither. Character, without a doubt. And then there were roofs. The thatched roofs seemed picturesque, of course, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sank, dripped, and from time to time, let in the local fauna. Nothing like a squirrel falling on your dinner for a pleasant evening. The windows, if they existed, were ridiculously small and usually covered with thin animal skins or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that probably not even the lord of the mansion could afford more than a small glass, and the peasants. These were satisfied if the wind did not tear the cow's skin off the wall during a blizzard. To make matters worse, the floors were usually compacted earth. When it rained or snowed a lot, the mud seeped through the floor, so you could technically say they had indoor water sources. not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own house felt like trudging through a frozen swamp. Cold below, cold above, cold inside. It was a three-dimensional attack on body heat. But medieval peasants were not ones to complain. They filled gaps with moss, covered drafts with old rags, and huddled together. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a little sheep fat smeared on the walls were often the only thing that kept them from becoming medieval icicles. Because if your house was falling apart and your best protection against the elements was mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh. Well, more or less, if your teeth didn't chatter too much. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to fight a silent enemy that arose from the depths. The frozen ground itself. At that time, the floors were not really floors. They were simply plots of land a little flatter inside the house. With a little luck, someone had thrown a little straw or old rushes to give the impression of comfort. But make no mistake, you would sleep one step away from the cold, hard ground. And alas, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, making its way through the straw to the bones and straight to the soul. If you dropped something on the floor during a winter night, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this tough battle in several ways. One method was to place thick layers of straw on the floor, if you could afford it. Or, more realistically, if you could steal enough from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you could get a decent insulating barrier. But the straw quickly flattened, became moldy even faster, and added an extra crunch to your already miserable nights. Some houses placed layers of dry rushes on the ground. From time to time, fresh rushes were thrown on top without cleaning the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decaying plants, fleas, and any mysterious creature that decided to settle there. It was basically a medieval carpet padding. If your carpet were alive, slightly damp, and smelled like wet dog, the beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames filled with, as you may have guessed, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had prickly, mobile, crunchy layers that didn't do much against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning in bed was not a matter of comfort. It was a desperate, clumsy dance to keep the blood circulating and prevent one side of your body from freezing. The truth is that medieval peasants did not conquer the frozen ground, but learned to live uncomfortably on it. Sleeping well at night had nothing to do with dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes intact. And if you achieved it, hey, you were better than most. If medieval houses had a single hero during the winter, it was not the roof or the walls, not even the brave layers of earth and manure that served as insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general sadness of medieval life. In the center of almost every peasant house, there was a simple fire. There were no chimneys with elegant stone ledges, nor neat stacks that expelled the smoke towards the sky. Instead, there was a simple hole or pile of stones, some half-burnt logs, and enough smoke entering the room to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into a ham. That's just how it is. Most houses did not even have chimneys. The smoke did what it could. It escaped through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or directly to the lungs if it felt lazy that night. It was not ideal for breathing or life expectancy, but on the plus side, it was very effective at scaring away fleas and other undesirable guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke all day? The hearth was not only used for heat. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of television. People sat around the fire to tell stories, gossip, or simply watch the flames because, frankly, there was not much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive was not just a good idea. It was mandatory. Letting the fire go out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you. Also, relighting the fire in winter was not as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, firewood, and more prayers than had ever been said. All family members had tasks: fanning the flames, watching the embers, adding firewood, sticks, or if lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the suffocating cold that wanted nothing more than finishing you off. The chimney did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival was impossible. It was a small, smoky, crackling, and often disappointing fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was anything that medieval peasants feared more than running out of beer, it was the fire going out during the night. Without that warm and flickering lifeline, the cold crept in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the middle of winter, relighting the fire from scratch was not just an inconvenience. It could be deadly. Matches did not exist yet. Lighters were still just a dream. Rekindling a fire meant hitting flint and steel, praying for a single precious spark, and then pampering that spark with tender love and any dry firewood that you had not burned days before. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing darkness, half asleep and with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance to motivate you even more. So the peasants became clever. They kept the fire going. No, not in a comfortable savings account. Keeping it meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ashes just before bed. The ash acted as a blanket, insulating the glowing embers and keeping them alive, barely, until the next morning. If you did it right, you could approach dawn, stir the mound a little, add fresh firewood, and voila, fire without freezing. But if you did not do it right, well, let's just say that the mornings were much colder and grumpier. Keeping the fire was an art passed down from parents to children like a precious family recipe. Everyone had their secrets. Some said that only dry ash should be used. Others insisted that it was essential for it to be a little damp. Some squeezed the embers tightly. Others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better method for keeping the fire. It was the old version of arguing about barbecue techniques, only with a little more at stake in terms of survival. Sometimes, keeping the fire was not enough. A hurricane-force wind could sneak through a crack and put out anyway, or a clumsy sheep could stumble upon the hearth. Yes, it happened. That is why some families took turns waking at night and checking embers. Basically, the medieval equivalent of sleepwalkers to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking had not so much to do with dominating nature as with gaining more hours of heat. And if upon waking there was a single ember left, that was victory, and enough to face another day fighting the cold. In the Middle Ages, the phrase, "the more, the merrier," did not refer only to parties. It was a survival tactic during winter. When the fire crackled and icy winds whistled through the cracks, there was a safe source of heat. Each one. And if that meant sleeping stuck to the family, the neighbors, the cattle, and possibly a confused goose, so be it. Forget personal space. Privacy was not even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal was not comfort. It was not comfort. It was not waking up frozen on the floor. The whole family piled in the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in any cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. The smallest children squeezed between their parents, the grandparents snuggled under the layers, and, if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you could sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated everywhere. If you were not lucky, you were left on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping by a freezer door. And what to anyone who moved too much during the night? You moved once to get comfortable, and suddenly you had pushed Aunt Maud toward the icy current by the wall. Congratulations, now you were the villain in the family. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of generations. And since hygiene was not exactly the best then, let's say it was not the most fragrant place to sleep. But hey, when facing freezing, you stop being picky. Body heat was not only pleasant, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately placing the strongest and warmest people on the outside of the group as human shields against cold. The babies and fragile old people snuggled in the center, treated as the small, precious heat generators they were. However, it was not just about surviving. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family ties. The long winter nights huddled together gave rise to stories, songs, and, without a doubt, interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So the next time your brother steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, remember that, at least, you are not fighting for a gap between a snoring uncle and a critical goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and some body heat. Bringing animals inside was not just a peculiar town tradition. It was vital to survival. The cattle generated heat, and in a poorly insulated cabin where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every degree mattered. Also, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was a little less likely that a neighbor would steal it from you in the middle of the night. Two birds, one stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic, living oven. The chickens nested in corners, the pigs grunted near the chimney, and the cows reclined luxuriously against the walls, ruminating as if they paid rent. It was not glamorous. Not at all. If you have ever been trapped in a car on a summer road trip with someone who has forgotten to shower, imagine that. But it is a cow. It is winter, and there is literally nowhere else to go. The smells are legendary. In spring, the perfume of a shared winter felt fierce. It was not really necessary to light a candle. The nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective sense of smell. They did not complain much because they knew an uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer toes froze in the morning. Some animals even had the best spots. Being the largest and warmest, the cows used to occupy the center of the stage near the family. The goats were allowed closer because of their heat, and because the goats, being goats, always found a way in. The hens perched on beams or in old baskets, and the pigs, well, the pigs did not care. They dropped where they felt like it, probably on the floor. Of course, sharing a bedroom with cattle was not without dangers. Imagine falling asleep peacefully and waking abruptly because a chicken decides your hair is a good place to perch, or because you step barefoot on something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Even so, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional kick in the ribs, the peasants understood the simple mathematics. The cold kills and the cows huddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against the icy fingers of winter, the warm and slightly drooling breath of a cow used to be the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion was not about looking good. It was about not dying. The peasants did not follow the latest trends. They dressed in layers, as if preparing to fight the Grim Reaper. The rule was simple. If you had it, you put it on. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic inner tunic, a rough and probably unclean linen shirt. On top, a thicker wool tunic. Then another, if you had it, some leggings that fell over the knees, a rough cape over the shoulders, and, if you were very lucky, a patched sheepskin thrown over it like a trophy. Congratulations. Now you are about 10% warmer and 90% spicier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in cloth or old rags and put them in clogs. If the cold continued, well, you simply added another rag and hoped not to lose a toe. And forget about washing all those layers. Washing clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, breaking the ice, and waiting 2 days for the only shirt you had to dry. If it did not freeze and become a tragic shirt, most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing. Interestingly, the accumulation of dirt and grease had an extra advantage: insulation. That grimy layer retained body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, only smellier and less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were very precious treasures. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between getting through the night or waking with your hair stuck to the wall. Gloves were usually handmade with any scrap of leather or fabric people could find. Sometimes they looked more like sad puppet costumes than fashion items. The children were especially wrapped up until they looked like stuffed turnips moving clumsily around the house. The goal was to retain as much body heat as possible. Style, elegance had never been heard of. Heat was the true medieval luxury. So the next time you complain about having to wrap up for a cold day, remember that medieval peasants went around wearing half their closet, looking like sacks of dirty clothes, and considering themselves lucky. In the medieval peasant's manual, dirt was not just something to rub off. It was practically a tool for survival. Apparently, being dirty wasn't a sign that you had given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, one might even say brilliant. You see, winter presented a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly ineffective at retaining heat. It was breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered between hypothermia and instant regret, breathability wasn't exactly a plus. That's where the dirt came in. As the peasants trudged day after day, without washing their clothes, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to accumulate on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the small gaps in the fabric, making the clothing more wind-resistant. It was like medieval waterproofing, only more smelly. Sure, you smelled like a goat that had lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medievals believed that too much washing in winter could make you sick. Better to keep that protective barrier of sacred dirt intact. Bathing was rare, washing clothes even more so, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for special occasions, such as when the bishop came or perhaps just before dying. To complete the strategy, the peasants put on several layers of clothing without changing the ones they wore underneath. You simply put the new layer on top of the previous month's. In the end, you became a walking museum of the last 6 weeks. Each stain told the heroic story of that time you slipped in the mud and didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants may have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene, but they knew that was not the case. That grimy, crunchy tunic was a thermal shield against death by freezing. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death for wanting to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, no one was offended. Olfactory insensitivity was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, dirt wasn't a failure. It was fashion. It was functionality. And if in February you had a thick, greasy outer layer, my friend, you were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent the winters huddled in luxurious feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean sleeping on a pile of dead plants and hoping for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford it, covered with a large sack filled with straw, hay, or old reeds. That's all. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, bulky, slightly pungent mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every movement during the night brought with it a delightful soundtrack of crunchy straw and, occasionally, a prick from a rebellious blade. Some peasants even dispensed with a wooden frame and simply threw the straw directly onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious floor-sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected sleep. Straw mattresses were not only uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, became moldy, attracted insects, and generally became a biohazard zone. Changing the straw was quite an event, usually done several times a year if you were diligent, or whenever the bed started moving without your permission. Reeds were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread densely on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs such as lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming smell of livestock from everyday life. Fresh reeds smelled great for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending perfectly with dirt, food scraps, and anything else that came in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming bugs enjoyed the straw almost as much as the peasants. If you woke up scratching more than sleeping, congratulations. You were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the difficulties, these humble beds were a lifesaver. The piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen ground. And when grouping together on them, bags of shared body heat were created. The medieval central heating in its fullest expression. So the next time you sink into your soft and fluffy mattress, remember that somewhere a medieval peasant is looking at you from history, smiling with a mouth full of lost teeth and saying, "It must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes are not just a nuisance. They are personal attacks. Medieval peasants did not only fight against the cold from the outside. They fought it from inside their own houses, armed with nothing more than what they could put in the cracks. And believe me, there were many cracks. The walls warped, the mud crumbled, the thatched roof sank. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak through every night, like a mischievous and spiteful poltergeist. Sealing the house became an art. The peasants filled the gaps with moss, straw, old rags, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, fluffy, or insulated a little, it was put into any hole. Some especially determined souls applied additional layers of mud and manure to the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine being there in a freezing climate, applying cold manure to your own house while muttering, "This is fine. This is a luxury," because, in a way, it was. The leaks in the roof were another battlefield. The straw, although cheap and abundant, was not exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. The peasants covered the holes in the roof with pieces of cloth, bundles of straw, or, in moments of true desperation, with pieces of turf stolen from the nearest field. In the end, all the houses began to look like a quilt a little sad, made by someone who gave up halfway. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were nothing more than wooden planks hung with iron nails and pure stubbornness. The holes in the windows were usually covered with animal skins or thick cloths soaked in animal fat to block the strongest drafts and add an extra aroma of mysterious meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, treacherous cold. One moment you were warm, and the next a sudden gust found the only point that had escaped you and woke you up suddenly like an icy hand of fate. However, somehow, thanks to their ingenuity, their stubbornness, and their refusal to accept the cold as a permanent state, the medieval peasants patched, filled, and managed as they could to survive the worst winters that nature could offer, one handful of mud after another. When the cold was so intense that it kept you awake at night, the medieval peasants had a solution. They didn't even try to pretend that everyone was sleeping at the same time. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't a big, organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was much simpler and much more desperate. Half of the family stayed awake, tending the fire and covering the drafts, while the other half huddled under threadbare blankets and straw, trying to sleep a few precious half-frozen hours. The fire needed constant attention. If left alone, it went out, and relighting it, remember, was as easy as making a stubborn donkey dance. So someone had to stand guard to watch the embers. And since no one wanted to get up once they were finally a little warm, the families took turns. You dozed for a few hours, were nudged awake, and then staggered to the fireplace to stoke the fire, poking and cursing it, while trying not to step on a goat. The shift was nothing glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no buttons to postpone the alarm for 5 more minutes. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment towards whoever snored the loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were recruited to help, soon learning that in winter everyone had to do their part or they would freeze trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed longer by the fire, both because of their experience and, frankly, because arthritis made getting up and down a titanic task. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck with people moving around, animals making noise, the wind hitting the walls, and the occasional nudge from a sibling who turned over too hard unintentionally. Sleeping well was a miracle. However, despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there were always a pair of eyes and some cold, reluctant hands ready to keep the fireplace alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So the next time you complain about having to get up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, think of the medieval peasants squinting at the smoky fire at 3 a.m. wondering if toes were really that important. After all, it's cold when you must think about how to breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the freezing air with layers, fires, and clever sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted how they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep breathing with the mouth open introduced freezing air directly into lungs. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than it took to pray a Hail Mary, it was a risk no one wanted to take. So the peasants learned the art of what we might call breathing for survival. Instead of gasping for air as if they had just run a marathon, they breathed shallowly, slowly, and through their noses. The idea was to warm the incoming air before it reached the lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing to death in February. If you accidentally took a big gulp of cold air, congratulations. You had just earned yourself a week of coughing, with what looked like your soul, without doctors in sight, and with grandma treating you with hot onion tea and fervent prayers. Some people even covered their faces with parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags while sleeping, creating a barrier to warm the air. Of course, this also meant that in the morning you ended up with a damp piece of cloth stuck to your mouth. But hey, it was better than freezing from inside out. Children were taught these tricks from a young age. Parents scolded the little ones for panting like dogs at home during cold months. And, frankly, between the strict breathing lessons, the itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to a farting goat, medieval childhood winters forged character on another level. At night, huddled in straw beds, under piles of layers, and next to a cow giving off steam, breathing became an art. Slow, steady, only through the nose, and as little as possible, like a somber medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more freezing and fewer inspiring quotes. In the Great Survival Manual, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked well. With shallow breaths, the peasants endured another night in the long war against winter. In the endless battle against the medieval winter, the peasants discovered a secret weapon, a full stomach. It turns out that one of the best ways to combat the cold was not another layer of rough wool. It was stuffing yourself with something heavy just before going to bed. Calories meant heat. The more the body had to digest, the more it warmed up as it did the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, you'll survive until morning without turning into a peasant popsicle. So what did the medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long, freezing night? Think of thick stews loaded with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Cereals were also vital. Oatmeal, barley porridge, or dense rye bread. If you were very lucky, for example after a feast day or a generous sacrifice, you could even get a piece of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. It wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. There were no delicate presentations or artisanal garnishes. It was a huge, brown meal designed to stay in your stomach like a brick, slowly burning overnight and keeping you warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating well. Foods that took longer to digest provided slow, steady heat. Fatty foods were especially appreciated, not only for the energy they provided, but because fat burns more slowly than lean meat. A stomach full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard. The ultimate luxury of the medieval winter. Parents made sure that even the pickiest children ate eagerly. No one cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips or spent the night shivering and thinking about how much you missed them. A tough but effective medieval-style way to raise children. Of course, eating a lot at night had its risks. You may have been warmer, but you also risked spending a night of vivid dreams fueled by a stomach desperately trying to process all the contents of a cabbage field. Was it worth it? Of course, because after all, the peasants weren't looking for a meal worthy of a Michelin star. They were looking to survive. And if that meant going to bed with a full, swollen stomach and breathing softly through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, it was just another night in the constant search to see another icy dawn. Long before electric blankets and luxurious heated mattresses, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted more warmth at bedtime. And that is how the humble hay box and the glamorous hot stone became the forgotten heroes of winter. Let's start with a hay box. It sounds rustic, and but the idea was genius. The peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it with a thick layer of hay, and use it to store food they'd cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge was thrown into the hay box, covered, and it stayed warm enough to have a late-night snack without having to risk relighting the fire. Basically, they were medieval slow cookers. But the peasants did not limit themselves to food. They realized that if hay could trap the heat of a pot, it could also trap the heat of something even better: the stones. We entered the era of hot stones. Before going to bed, someone, probably the unlucky child who had lost a family argument, would take a flat stone and throw it into the fireplace. After roasting it until it was almost too hot to touch, on the border between useful and a third-degree burn, they would take it out with a stick or old tongs. The stone, still radiating wonderful heat, was carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into a piece of old cloth, or placed in a clay pot, and then slipped under the hay of the mattress or at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to fight the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone well, congratulations. Now you had a small, localized fire in your house. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went well, that stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen cabin, luxury was defined as not waking with icicles hanging from your nose. In the great arsenal of medieval survival in winter, a hot stone hidden among the hay may not seem very glamorous, but for the peasants who clung to any source of heat they could find, it was a small miracle. In the house of a medieval peasant, the hearth was not only the place where dinner was cooked, it was practically another member of the family. A temperamental, smoky, and sometimes uncooperative member, certainly, but absolutely essential for survival, especially at bedtime. The closer you were to the fire, the more likely you were to wake up without freezing. That meant that the distribution of sleeping places depended not so much on personal preferences as on strategic position. Babies, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail had priority in choosing the best spot. Parents, older children, and stronger adults were distributed around them like human insulating layers. Being assigned a place near the fire was not just a show of kindness. It was a matter of survival. Babies were fragile heat generators, and the elderly were valuable repositories of family knowledge and, let's face it, the best gossip. Protecting them with heat was essential. But it wasn't all about warming up by the fire. If you got too close, you ran the risk of waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoking suspiciously. If you went too far away, it was like camping in a refrigerator. It was a delicate dance. You have to stay close enough to enjoy the warmth of the fire, but not so close that you have to explain to your neighbor why you look like a half-cooked roast. The fire also did not distribute heat evenly. For the most part, it warmed the people who were directly in front of it, while everyone else fought for the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards fighting for a ray of sunshine. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep in front of the fire, you might have one side wonderfully warm and the other so frozen that you could probably knock it. Pets and livestock, of course, also got in the way. A dog could get between you and the fire, wagging its tail dangerously close to the flames. Chickens sometimes perched precariously on the hearthstones, clucking softly in the night like small feathered guardians of the heat. Each crackle of the logs, each movement of the glowing embers was a small promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so, the peasants were plunged into a restless dream, lulled by the crackles and whistles of the fire, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It was not perfect. It was not comfortable, but it was life clinging to heat by a thread of incandescent embers. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become an elegant frozen statue in January. Survival was not just a family matter. It was a project of the whole town, a messy, muddy, and noisy collaboration in which the heat and life of all depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the middle of winter, a strong fire in a pile of hay could not do much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed it. If the smoke from Old Tom's chimney stopped rising to the sky, someone was going to see what was happening. And not only because Tom owed you a chicken, although that could be part of it, but because community meant survival. The towns had unofficial winter watchmen, often young or old, who could not work in the field, but could watch who coughed too much, who had not gone to the market to exchange products in several days, or whose house seemed too quiet in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of the neighborhood watch, without the reflective vests, but with many more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was almost an emergency. A good neighbor quickly came with a burning coal wrapped in rags, or, better yet, invited them to spend the night in their own smoky and crowded cabin. Yes, that meant squeezing 4 more people into an already small space, but it was better than finding your friends frozen when spring arrived. Community food stores also played an important role. During particularly harsh winters, towns sometimes took out their last reserves of salted meat, cereals, and dried vegetables. It was a somber charity. No one had much, but a few community meals could make the difference between making it to spring or not. Even the children understood what was at stake. They helped distribute firewood, shared embers, and carried urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter knocked on the door. Of course, medieval villages were not all sunshine and hugs. There were disputes. The disputes over land, goats, or who had borrowed the good cooking pot never completely disappeared. But when the nights turned deadly cold, old grudges were usually quietly filed away. After all, arriving was still worth it because the next day it could be you who needed to be rescued. In the frozen heart of winter, the town became a large, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. A muddy boot, a crackling ember, a frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the relentless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on layers or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside the paper-thin walls and the fire was reduced to dying embers, all the help possible was needed, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday thing back then. It was interwoven into every icy breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and rough wool, families knelt together and prayed hastily that the fire would continue to burn, the roof would remain intact, and their toes would remain attached in the morning. The saints became more than distant sacred figures. They were the first line of defense against winter. Same, for example, was invoked to protect against throat conditions. It was no small concern when a puff of icy air could make you cough until you vomited. St. Nicholas was not just the cheerful gift giver of later legend. He was also asked to protect homes from sudden ruin during the months of scarcity and death. Superstitions were closely intertwined with daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the fireplace before sleeping, hoping it would protect them from evil spirits or, at least, from treacherous drafts. Others marked the doors with blessed chalk after certain holidays, begging for warmth and luck to enter their homes. Candles also played an important role. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept lit throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold darkness that scratched at the walls. And, of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without some promises. Dear Lord, if you help us get through this night, I swear I will be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. The faith was not merely an abstract consolation. It was an urgent, daily conversation. The peasants did not ask for luxuries, only survival. A little warmth, a little food, and one more day to get ahead until spring broke the cold embrace that enveloped their small villages. It was a simple hope whispered between the smoke-filled beams, entangled in broken prayers, and hidden under itchy blankets that, somehow, helped them overcome the endless winter nights. Despite all the ingenuity, prayers, and obstinacy with which medieval peasants faced winter, the truth felt chilling. Sometimes that was not enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unfortunates. It took entire families, entire towns, which disappeared into silence under a heavy blanket of snow and ice. Some winters were especially cruel, like the infamous winter of the Great Famine of 1315, when the rains destroyed the crops, the cattle starved, and the freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into devastating disaster. People were so desperate that it was rumored that they ate shoe leather, bark, and, in the most horrible cases, each other. Not keeping the fire lit was not just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence. Without the meager heat from the fireplace, families huddled together for the last time. Sometimes neighbors stumbled upon entire families in spring. The bodies were still intertwined in a frozen embrace, as if trying to share a little more warmth until the end. The houses themselves could collapse under the weight of snow or ice storms. That a roof collapsed in the middle of a freezing night was not just a catastrophe. It was often deadly. Crawling through the snow, which reached up to the thighs, to ask neighbors for shelter was no guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already at their limit. Diseases also loved the cold. Hunger weakened the body and crowded. Smoke-filled houses became hotbeds of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily turn into a funeral by January. And then there was the silent horror, the freezing. The fingers and toes, even the ears, turned black and died without detaching from their owners. Some villagers survived the winters at the cost of their limbs. A somber badge of honor that said, "I made it, but winter has taken part of me." However, the most disturbing thing is not only death, but the disturbing normality with which it was lived. People accepted that every winter some of them would not see the thaw. Death was not unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, awaiting his turn. Even in the midst of the intense cold and constant threat, medieval peasants kept going, stubborn, afflicted, clinging to life. Because while there was an ember left in the fireplace, a breath suspended in the freezing air, there was still a fight worth fighting for. When we look back at the medieval peasants, those muddy and frozen survivors of endless winters, it is tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-filled huts. But under all that struggle hides something far more powerful. A legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unwavering resilience. They had no central heating, thermal jackets, or comfortable memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of taking it for granted that they would survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was a model of resilience. Each straw mattress, each hand-stoked fire, each gap in the wall filled with moss was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with an impossible situation, they did not collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the harsh lessons that each brutal winter imparted. Their communities were built on more than shared lands. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to care for the sick, to share resources when food was scarce, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant that someone could help you tomorrow. They lived with the certainty that no one can beat winter alone. Their faith was also a form of resistance. Prayers were part of their daily life, not only out of fear, but out of hope. A fragile and stubborn hope that the next day would be a little warmer, a little brighter. The hope was that, after 100 dark nights, spring would return and life would find a way to break through frozen ground. And somehow it was indeed. Thanks to their sacrifices, their unglamorous victories, to surviving one more night, future generations prospered. Little by little, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters that their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth became common instead of distant dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are invisibly sewn into the lives we now live. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every winter afternoon we spend drinking tea in dim light. All of this is the result of countless medieval peasants who refused to surrender to cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-glazed window, maybe spare them a thought. To the anonymous and brave who turned survival amid tremors, into a living legacy. An ember, a breath, a stubborn heartbeat at each time. And Boleyn did not come into the world with a crown or armies at her feet. Born around 1501, probably in Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with powerful family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, Anne's birth barely caused a stir. However, from these modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking root. A life that would one day change English history. From a very early age, and distinguished herself not by wealth, but by her mind. She was intelligent, vivacious, and, by all accounts, magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent, where her education truly began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the dazzling court of the Netherlands, an experience few English girls could dream of. There, Anne absorbed the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France where Anne's brilliance was truly polished. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Margaret of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, and wit. While other young women perfected embroidery and mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of attracting attention without appearing to seek it. When she returned to England in the early 1520s, and was something exceptional, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtesans and who, at the same time, harbored the ambition of a rising English family. She was not a classic beauty. Even her admirers admitted it, but she captivated. Dark eyes that shone with intelligence, a fast and musical voice, a way of moving that suggested a purpose hidden under layers of courtesy. And not only entered rooms, but changed their gravity. In an era when a woman's destiny was usually sealed by her birth and marriage, and refused to fall into oblivion. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts, and she intended to use that knowledge in her own country. And Boleyn was then a young, intelligent, ambitious, inexperienced woman, but history was already stirring around her. The young woman who returned to England was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a piece in a larger game, one that would soon envelop the crown itself. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had seen. In a world full of pale and modest English roses, and was an electric storm, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and quick wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of King Henry VIII. At first, she played the role that was expected of her, that of lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the shadow of the Queen, Anne's presence shone like a candle too bright to extinguish. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence that few women dared show. Men noticed her. Women gossiped. The court murmured about the striking girl from Boleyn. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, that of the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret relationships. But Anne was different. She would not melt at his compliments or fall into his arms like so many others. She teased. She challenged him. He rejected her. Enrique, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated. The more Anne kept him at a distance, the more he fell in love. They exchanged letters full of declarations of love, frustration, and longing. Enrique offered her the role of royal lover, the most powerful unofficial position in court, and, surprisingly, said no. She did not want to be one more conquest, a forgotten lover lost to time. If Enrique wanted her, he would have to make her his wife. It was such a bold bet that it left the court stunned. After all, the king was already married. His queen, Catalina, was loved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Enrique would have to defy the church itself to claim Anna. But Anna did not flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, where queens wielded subtle power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew that ambition was a dangerous game, but it was one she was willing to win. Standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, Anna de Boleyn made a decision, not to be simply admired, but to change her destiny and England's forever. What began as an intense flirtation between King Enrique VIII and Anna de Boleyn soon became a national crisis. Enrique was not simply in love. He was obsessed, and in his obsession, he was willing to shatter everything that England had known for centuries. The king's desire to marry Anna ran into one small obstacle, namely, that he was already married to Queen Catalina de Aragon. Catalina, dignified and resilient, refused to step aside silently. She had been Enrique's faithful wife for 2 decades, and, in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the legitimate queen. Divorce was not only scandalous, but almost unthinkable. But Enrique was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catalina was cursed because she had been married to his brother Arturo. It did not matter that the Pope had granted special permission for their union years ago. Enrique now insisted that his soul would be condemned unless he annulled the marriage, and, for her part, knew that she should not appear too eager. She stayed out of Enrique's reach, alternating between fueling his hopes and keeping her distance. Every look, every word was calculated. She was not only aspiring to marriage, she was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted in whispers and factions. Some noble families eagerly courted Anne's favor, seeing how the winds of power were changing. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catalina, horrified at the idea of Anna replacing her. Diplomats wrote desperate letters to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Enrique's own advisors were restless. They felt the ground shaking under their feet. As the months turned into years, Enrique's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, manipulated his lawyers to find legal loopholes, and began to realize that the Church would not give in easily. Catalina had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Carlos V, the most powerful man in Europe. Even so, Enrique moved forward, defying advice, tradition, and increasingly, the law itself. His courtship of Anna had become something much bigger than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very structure of England's political and religious life, and was not only conquering the heart of a king, she was dragging an entire kingdom into unknown territory. A dangerous game had begun, and there was no turning back. After almost 7 agonizing years of maneuvers, scandals, and diplomatic chaos, and Berlin's bet bore fruit. In January 1533, she secretly wed Henry VIII, a bold decision, given he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. In June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the culminating moment of her life, but the atmosphere was far from one of widespread joy. The people of London watched with weary eyes. Some cheered, others murmured prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered if this new queen, with her French manners and daring spirit, was a blessing or curse, and entered royalty not as a beloved figure, but as a tempest. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, and was dazzling, provocative, and politically astute. She wore bold colors, dominated the court with sharp intelligence, and made powerful enemies at dizzying speed. Her position, though seemingly secure, was also terribly precarious. Everything depended on one thing, giving Henry a male heir, and knew that as well as anyone. She was no longer simply Henry's mistress. She was the hope of a dynasty. At the beginning of the pregnancy, Anne and Henry were euphoric, sure that the child would be male. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl named Elizabeth. It must be recognized that Anne knew how to elegantly disguise her deep disappointment, insisting that the next child would undoubtedly be male. Henry, however, was not so serene. His eyes, once full of adoration, now shone with doubt. Even so, for a time, Anne's star shone brightly. She remodeled the English court in her own image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen to be crowned in England. crowned with the sacred oil normally reserved for kings. Her influence was enormous. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Messengers shifted alliances to be in her grace. The once obedient Henry began to officially distance England from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head. Also, that Anne's crown could not be questioned. However, even in her triumph, storm clouds gathered. Friends murmured in secret. Rivals lurked, waiting, and Henry, fickle and restless, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him and had won the throne. But keeping it would require more than charm, ambition, or love. And Berlin had reached higher than almost any woman of her era. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Almost from the moment the crown was placed on her head, cracks began to appear in her world. At the center of Anne's struggles was pressure to give birth to a male heir. Her first daughter, Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son in whom Henry had placed his dynastic hopes, and time was running out, and suffered multiple pregnancies in rapid succession, but disappointment soon followed. Miscarriages left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child undermined the foundation she had built. Henry, who had previously been passionately devoted to her, began to distance himself. His disappointment opened a gulf between them, and, who had never been able to suffer in silence, argued, demanded, and fought to maintain her place. But Henry, a man who valued obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her rebelliousness, the very fire that once attracted him. Outside the royal chambers, enemies gathered like wolves. Many nobles who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth now openly plotted her downfall. The supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgave and for what they considered theft and sacrilege. Even the commoners murmured against her, calling her the great culprit of the break with Rome and the drastic changes that followed. And then Jane Seymour arrived. Calm, demure, everything that Anna was not. Jane captured Enrique's wandering attention just as Anna's influence began to wane. While Anna had dazzled him with her brilliance and her defiance, Jane offered him a reassuring complacency. It was a dangerous shift, and Anna, perceptive as always, realized what was happening. She tried to recover her position, lavishing attention on Enrique, promising him more children and begging him for patience. But the king, ever fickle, had already begun to imagine a life without the woman for whom he destroyed a kingdom. Anna's political enemies, among them Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, perceived the change of course. They began to lay the groundwork for a campaign of destruction. They silently collected accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition with such mastery was now losing ground. Anna had won her crown with cunning and courage. But in the brutal, changing world of Enrique's court, past victories mattered little. Only new successes counted, and Anna's enemies sharpened knives. The queen who had destroyed a kingdom would soon see how quickly a kingdom could destroy her. The enemies of Anna of Berlin did not attack her with armies or swords. They arrived with whispers, secrets, and carefully crafted lies. In the back rooms of the court, treason brewed. Silent, patient, deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anna's greatest ally in the English Reformation, had turned against her. Their alliance had been based on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anna wanted reforms to aid the poor and limit the power of the greedy nobles. Cromwell wanted stability, Enrique's favor, and no interference in his affairs. Anna's audacity had made her dangerous, and in Enrique's fickle heart, love had transformed into irritation, suspicion, and cold distance. Anna had few true friends left. Even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now clashed with the court's desire for a kinder, more docile queen. And Jane Seymour, calm and calculating, waited out of sight. The perfect contrast to Anna's extinguished fire. Cromwell was the first to act, knowing Enrique was restless and that the king wanted a way out but lacked a convenient excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anna could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Enrique, but through dishonor? The accusations were far-fetched, monstrous: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Anna, the proud, brilliant queen, was painted as a traitor, a seductress, a threat to the crown she herself had redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, obtaining confessions under torture and turning courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anna's own brother, George Boleyn, were arrested. The charges did not make much sense. They were plagued by contradictions and impossibilities. But in Enrique's court, the truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anna, feeling the noose tighten, fought desperately. She appealed to Enrique's memory, to the love they had once shared, but it was useless. The man who had once divided England for her now refused to look her in the eye. In May 1536, Anna was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. When the great door slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn, trapped in the brutal game she had once played with such mastery. Treason had sealed her fate, and now, alone in the tower, and Boleyn awaited the final move. And Boleyn was standing in the great hall of the Tower of London, facing a court of nobles. Many owed their titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman who had once changed England's destiny. The charges against her were shocking. Adultery with several men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, high treason, conspiracy against the king. In another world, such accusations against a queen would have seemed unthinkable. But here, now, they were simply theater, a somber performance designed to give Enrique VII exactly what he wanted. The fall of Anna wrapped in a fine veil of legality. Anna defended herself with the same ardor that in her day had conquered Enrique's heart. She denied all the accusations with intelligence, precision, and an unbreakable composure that surprised even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, an anointed queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all in vain. The verdict was decided long before Anna stepped into the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and the people, the public destruction of a woman who once had been unbreakable. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, pronounced condemning words. The dates and places contradicted each other. The evidence was flimsy when it existed. But the truth no longer mattered. Anna was found guilty. Her brother Jorge and the other men accused with her were also sentenced to death. Anna would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual death of traitors, which consisted of hanging, drawing, and quartering, and beheading. When the verdict was read, she stood upright, unbroken, her face pale, but her spirit fiercely intact. In those last moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die and praying that God would have mercy on her soul. When the heavy doors of the room closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm that had been and brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable was about to end. But not even then did they understand it. They were not erasing Anna de Boleyn. They were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After the trial, Anna de Boleyn was returned to the Torre de Londres, not as the triumphant queen who had once ruled England, but as a prisoner sentenced to death. However, even before the end, Anna refused to collapse. In the cold and resounding corridors of the tower, Anna prepared herself. She spent hours praying, kneeling on the hard stone floor, her hands tightly clasped and her voice firm. She did not confess any crime because she believed she had not committed any. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who had remained faithful to her, wept privately and consoled them instead of the other way around. Sometimes she joked bitterly that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her black humor was the spark of stubbornness that had made her unforgettable. Enrique VIII, for his part, showed no sign of piety. He had already set his eyes on Jane Seymour. Even before the date of Anne's execution was set, Enrique was arranging his next marriage. For Anna, this last betrayal by the man who had once overthrown a kingdom for her must have been the hardest blow. On May 18th, 1536, Anna was informed that she would die the next morning. That night, she slept very little. Instead, she spent her last hours praying, asking God for forgiveness for all those who had hurt her, and perhaps also for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her there. Enrique, in a flash of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution in a faster, cleaner, and less brutal way than with an axe. It was a small gesture of mercy, perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anna's comfort. At dawn, Anna dressed carefully for her last moment. A dark gray damask dress adorned with furs, a crimson kirt. Underneath, colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She gathered her dark hair and placed it under a simple coif, ready to face the sword with elegance. As the cold morning mist of the tower swirled around the stones of the courtyard, Anna Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a last act of courage before the judgment of history. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anna de Boleyn climbed the scaffold built inside the Torre de Londres. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anna remained upright, her gray dress waving gently in the cold morning breeze. She seemed thinner than in court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics or sobs. In any case, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once brought a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the health and prosperity of the king, the same man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anna offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage surprised even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought especially to guarantee a quick death, stepped forward. Anna knelt upright, her hands together in prayer and eyes raised to the sky. They blindfolded her with a small white cloth. She remained motionless. The sword shone once, silent, quick, and Anna de Boleyn, queen, mother, creator of history, ceased to exist. She was quickly buried in a nameless tomb within the tower grounds, in a chest pierced by arrows, as a suitable coffin had not been prepared for her. A queen once crowned with gold now disappeared without ceremony. However, Anna's story did not end in that cold tomb. Her daughter Isabel, the girl whose birth had disappointed a king, would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Isabel I, the virgin queen whose reign would see the flourishing of art, power, and England's global influence. A queen who inherited the fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unwavering resistance of her mother. Anna de Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Roma and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be dethroned. However, through her blood, through Isabel, Anna's legacy shone brighter than any crown she wore in life. In the end, Anna de Boleyn achieved a kind of immortality, not for her survival, but for her indelible impact on history. In the early 1770s, the American colonies were seething like a pot left too long on a burning fire. The relationship with Great Britain, which was once considered the proud mother country, had soured and turned into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It did not start with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. This law was followed by the Townshend Acts, which taxed basic products such as paper, glass, and paint. Each new law passed thousands of kilometers away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation was like another spark falling on dry brush. At first, the anger manifested in polite petitions and incendiary pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about freedom and rights. But as time passed, frustration turned into something darker. A slow awareness that Great Britain was not listening. Worse still, Great Britain did not care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they made enough noise, if they reasoned firmly enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes, and sometimes they succeeded. The Stamp Act was repealed after strong colonial protests. But each small victory was followed by new laws, new taxes, new insults. It was not about money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What angered the colonists was the principle. They were taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, governed as distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secret and fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions erupted into violence when British soldiers shot at unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones there. Trust was now a thing of the past. In 1773, the colonies found themselves at the edge of the abyss. A final insult would push them to open defiance, and it did not arrive in the form of soldiers, new laws, or armies, but in the silent and apparently harmless form of boxes stacked with tea. The colonists did not know it yet, but the night that the tea floated in the cold waters of Boston's port, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a key miscalculation. Believing that the American colonies would accept cheaper tea without protest, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the battered British East India Company and reaffirm Great Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it seemed a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, eliminating intermediaries, reducing prices, and offering a luxury product at a very low price, a few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, because the problem was not the price of tea, but the principle behind it. The Tea Act firmly maintained the hated tax on tea. Accepting the tea, even if discounted, would mean recognizing Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. For many Americans, that seemed unthinkable. A waiver of the freedoms for which they had fought for over a decade. News of the Tea Act spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. Merchants were quite enraged. They saw their livelihood threatened by a monopoly that would end all local trade. Patriots were enraged by the underlying message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it wanted. In Boston, reaction was especially fierce. Boston, a city already marked by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Rejecting the tea became a matter of honor, a test of loyalty to freedom. Public meetings quickly multiplied. The newspaper columns burned with rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts and swore that no tea from the East India Company would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. Throughout the colonies, ships carrying the tea were rejected by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear. They will not buy us off. But in Boston, fate took a turn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Ella Lenina, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the port, and stayed there, refusing to set sail. Royal officials insisted that the tea be unloaded. The colonists simply refused. A stalemate ensued like a top bow. The tension felt unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same. While the British ships with the tea remained anchored in Boston's port, the city was transformed into a powder keg. Each passing day, without a solution, increased the tension. Boston was not just resisting. It was preparing to fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by passionate voices such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved quickly to organize resistance. They published public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held noisy meetings that brought together farmers, artisans, and merchants. Each meeting added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center for resistance. Thousands crowded into the wooden room, their breath fogging the air and their voices rising in defiance. There, resolutions were passed, speeches were given, and tempers flared. Each vote against unloading the tea was another blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston remained united, the clock kept ticking. British law demanded that imported products, like tea, be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that, once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost forever. It was no longer just about tea. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights or if they would rise up and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, stood firm. He refused to let the tea ships sail without unloading their merchandise, insisting that the law be obeyed. To hell with colonial outrage. For him, yielding meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. The confrontation in Boston became a spectacle. Everyone, men, women, and children, knew something was going to happen. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sensation before a storm, when the world holds its breath. It only took a spark to light the fuse. And somewhere between the crowded streets and the squeezed hearts of Boston, a decision was silently brewing. A plan that would resonate across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773, dawned gray and cold in Boston, a city on the edge of history. For almost 3 weeks, the tea ships had remained in port like ticking time bombs. Now the deadline had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of the ship's arrival. If not, customs officials could confiscate the cargo, and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle would be lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause and their claim to rights and freedom would crumble. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and colonists from the surrounding area crowded into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in the city. Some had walked kilometers through the freezing countryside to be there. The meeting was so crowded that men overflowed into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of the rebellion, presided over the meeting. One after another, speakers rose to denounce the tea law, to clamor against tyranny, and to urge immediate action. But even amid the rebelliousness, the uncertainty was palpable. What could be done without triggering open war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to a brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained impassive. The ships would not be allowed to sail without unloading. The tea would be confiscated, the tax would be collected, and the king's law would be enforced. The crowd seethed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to tremble with the force of it. However, Samuel Adams remained calm and uttered the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple phrase, but everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. They would move on to action. Outside, a war cry pierced the growing twilight. It was the signal. The men quickly disguised themselves, smearing soot on their faces and covering themselves with blankets and feathers in a crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message that no one could mistake. The term had expired. Boston would respond, not with words, but with defiance. As twilight intensified over Boston on December 16th, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Some figures moved among the shadows. They were ordinary men wrapped in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot and some adorned with feathers. They were not trying to deceive anyone by passing themselves off as authentic Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act to shed their old identities and adopt a new, fierce posture. By dozens, they headed to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were anchored. The harbor water stirred, cold and dark beneath them, thick from the cutting winter air. There were no shouts or drunken chaos. It was not a riot. It was a mission carried out with calm, relentless precision. Armed with axes and sticks, the disguised colonists invaded the ships and overwhelmed the few crew members still on board. No harm was done to the sailors. They were set aside and watched silently as the operation began. The men opened the wooden chests with expert blows, and the aroma of fresh tea spread in the cold night air. Others threw the boxes overboard, their heavy splashes echoing in the calm harbor waters. Box after box, 342 in total, were broken and thrown until the black water swirled with thousands of kilos of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the dock, silently, terrified. The British Guard stationed nearby made no move to intervene. It is not clear if it was due to confusion, sympathy, or fear that the violence would escalate. Some accounts suggest that even among those loyal to Great Britain, there was an understanding. Something had changed, and nothing would stop it that night. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one looted the ships in search of valuables. Only the tea was attacked, the hated symbol of British oppression. In a city where hunger and hardship were a daily reality, men could easily have turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They didn't do it. When it was all over, the harbor looked like a large boiling cauldron full of broken chests and soaked tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the acrid scent of crushed tea, filling the night air with a strange bittersweet aroma. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, fading into the alleys and lanes of Boston. They left no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken boxes floated in the dark water, Boston remained still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot, a fight, or a drunken spectacle. It was something much rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbor was transformed into a gigantic, rotating teapot. Thousands of kilos of tea from the East India Company floated in large mats on the water, dyeing it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, collected handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be reprimanded by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing could be saved. No one would benefit from that night's work. It was a matter of principle, pure and simple. The city woke up the next morning with the smell of salty tea floating in the air. The news spread like wildfire, by word of mouth, letters, pamphlets. By noon, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions quickly divided. Among the patriots, there was pride, a fierce and growing pride, that ordinary men had confronted the most powerful empire in the world and struck a blow for freedom. Among the loyalists and moderates, there was horror. For them, the destruction of the property was reckless and dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line from which they could not turn back? Governor Thomas Hutchinson roared in his mansion, furious at both the destruction and the message it sent. If the king's authority could be so blatantly challenged in Boston, where else might rebellion break out? British officials were stunned. They expected protests, boycotts, perhaps another riot like the ones that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They did not expect organized and disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without even breaking a window. The captains of the ships Dartmouth, Evelina, and Beaver could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared under the waves. In the official accounting books, the gentleman's loss would be accounted for at more than 10,000 pounds sterling, a fortune. But the real loss was not measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, loyalty, and the fragile illusion that Great Britain still ruled its colonies with their consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface. An undeniable, shared truth. The era of peaceful protest was coming to an end. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was prepared. When news of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. For British officials, this was not simply a protest. It was a rebellion, an open and mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. It is said that King George III, upon hearing the news, grew cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, erupted in outrage. They demanded punishment not only for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh that they quickly received the nickname Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came quickly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal blow, Parliament ordered the closure of the bustling port of Boston, the city's economic livelihood, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored. Ships could no longer enter or leave. Trade disappeared. Goods and supplies ran out. Boston, once a vibrant and noisy city, fell silent, its docks eerily quiet. But the punishment did not stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-government rights, placing it firmly under the control of officials appointed by the king. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Great Britain, a clear message that British authorities were untouchable. And to make sure the colonies knew that force was an option, British soldiers were quartered throughout Boston, living among the citizens they were supposed to subdue. The message was clear. The rebellion would be crushed. Freedom was a luxury that the Crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unintended effect. Instead of scaring and subduing the other colonies, it outraged them. News of Boston's suffering, with its port closed and its population starving under martial law, sparked deep sympathy and righteous anger throughout America. Wagons loaded with food and supplies arrived in Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support, promises of unity, and secret meetings began to unite the previously fragmented colonies. What was once a Massachusetts problem was quickly becoming an American one. By punishing Boston, Great Britain hoped to set an example. Instead, they turned Boston into a symbol, a cry of resistance. The flames of revolution, which had previously flickered in isolated pockets, began to burn from colony to colony and would not be easily extinguished. The punishment of Boston sent shock waves far beyond the rocky coasts of Massachusetts. In the 13 colonies, outrage turned into something far more dangerous for Great Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, arguing and competing, separated by geography, religion, and trade rivalries. But when Parliament closed the Port of Boston and stripped Massachusetts of its self-government, Americans across the continent realized that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response was swift. The settlers sent carts full of food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the suffering town of Boston. The municipal meetings seethed with anger. The printing presses worked day and night to spread the news. The fight was no longer just of Boston. It was of everyone. And so, in September of 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress was convened in Philadelphia. For the first time, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies met under one roof to discuss a unified response. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, who before were mere regional figures, now joined as artificers of a movement that grew day by day. Their objective, at least officially, was still not total independence. The majority still hoped for reconciliation, the return to the old relationship of mutual respect under the British Crown, but under the courteous debates and the carefully worded petitions, a deeper understanding was taking root. The colonies could no longer afford to remain separated. In the Congress, they agreed to a widespread boycott of British products. They committed to support each other in the face of new British aggressions. And they made it clear that any attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses throughout the continent, common people began to use words that before were only whispered in private: unity, resistance, freedom. By hitting hard in Boston, Great Britain imagined that it could crush the rebellion. Instead, it had united the colonies in something much more dangerous. A people that, despite their differences, began to consider themselves not as dispersed provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution no longer only blew. They were becoming a storm, and it was too late for Great Britain to stop it. The night that the tea sank in the port of Boston, not only were boxes destroyed, it was the illusion that the American colonies could continue being loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king, no army, no distant parliament could ever extinguish. In the following months, that spark spread throughout all the colonies. What before were protests, boycotts, and educated petitions became an open resistance. The militias of the cities began to train openly. The warehouses were filled with gunpowder and bullets. The men who before toasted to King George III in the taverns now whispered about the revolution under the same roofs. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice, battered but unbowed. The more Great Britain tried to reinforce its control, the more the colonies slipped from its hands. Each ship that passed through the closed and silent port of Boston was a silent reminder that tyranny had found its rival in American rebelliousness. When the Parliament approved the intolerable laws, it intended to turn Boston into an example to scare the other colonies and force them to submit. Instead, it had created a martyr city, a war cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, the settlers realized that their destinies were united. The resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. In the spring of 1775, the tension reached its peak in the outskirts of Boston. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, the British troops sent to confiscate the colonial weapons encountered armed farmers, ordinary men willing to defend their rights with musket shots. The first shots of the American Revolution sounded, a direct line that goes back to the moment in which the men chose the principles above the benefit and threw a fortune into the port. In the port, the Boston Tea Party demonstrated to the world that the revolution is not always announced with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it begins in silence, with a small group of determined people who stand in the cold and choose defiance above fear. By throwing the tea, the settlers were not only rejecting the taxes, they were rejecting an empire. And although the road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one thing was clear that night in the port of Boston. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they had just begun. Before the imposing pyramids of Giza, before the Mesopotamian cities seethed with life, before Stonehenge rose against the sky, Corral existed. Hidden in the dry valleys of the coast of Peru, Carroll rose with silent majesty almost 5,000 years ago, only to disappear almost completely, swallowed by the sands and forgotten to history. For centuries, the world did not know of its existence. The Sup Valley, where Carroll once prospered, seems at first glance an unlikely place for civilization to flourish. The landscape is arid, barren, the river little more than a silver thread that winds between rocks and dust. To most eyes, it seemed inhospitable, a place abandoned by life. However, it was here, in the midst of desolation, that one of humanity's first great cities took shape. Carroll was not just a collection of scattered huts or a temporary trading post. It was a planned city that stretched over 150 acres, full of pyramids, squares, residential neighborhoods, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and vision. A complex society that flourished centuries before the Egyptians began stacking stones to build their pyramids. The people of Carroll achieved this without the wheel, written language, or metal tools. They built massive structures of stone and earth with nothing more than ingenuity, community effort, and the raw power of human will. However, for thousands of years, the existence of Carroll remained secret. Even when travelers stumbled upon the strange, eroded mounds scattered throughout the valley, they mistook them for natural formations, simple hills sculpted by desert winds. No one imagined that under the sand was one of the world's oldest cities, predating even the civilizations that history books had crowned as first. It was not until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, discovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust of time would rewrite the history of the Americas and force the world to reconsider what it thought it knew about the birth of civilization itself. Carroll had emerged, flourished, and fallen into absolute anonymity. Now, after millennia of silence, its stones speak again, whispering about a peaceful and intelligent people who built a complex and wonderful world in a land where life itself seemed impossible. And this was only the beginning of its history. At first glance, the Sup Valley seems a place where life would struggle to exist. Hurricane winds lash endless expanses of sand and stone. The sun beats down mercilessly, drying out the land and turning the landscape into a cracked, brittle surface. Water is scarce. The river is a winding thread that struggles to survive. To the untrained eye, it is a wasteland, arid, empty, forgotten by the gods. But the inhabitants of Carroll saw something different. They did not see a desert to fear. They saw a blank canvas. They recognized the river, however modest, as the lifeblood of possibilities. And so, with patience, ingenuity, and pure determination, they turned this inhospitable place into a thriving oasis of life and culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They learned to tame the seasonal floods of the river, building simple but brilliant irrigation systems that channeled water through the valley floor. Where others saw sand and dust, they sprouted green shoots of hope. Cotton, beans, pumpkins, guavas, sweet potatoes. Cotton, in particular, became their treasure. It was spun to make fishing nets and textiles, boosting trade and creating links that extended far beyond their desert home. But cultivation was only part of their mastery. The inhabitants of Carroll understood that survival in the desert required balance. They worked with nature, not against it. They built their houses and squares with stone and earth, designed to withstand both the scorching heat and the sparse, torrential rains that occasionally lashed the valley. They studied the stars and the seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the veins of the Carroll economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handicrafts flowed throughout the coast. In return, Carroll received exotic products. Colored shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, ideas from distant peoples. They were not isolated. They were connected. In a land where survival seemed impossible, Carroll thrived thanks to intelligence, innovation, and community. They did not conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, building a society that was not only functional. It was extraordinary. Against all odds, Carroll flourished, becoming a beacon of civilization. And that was only the beginning. Rising above the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Corral defy everything we believe to know about the first civilizations of America. It was not about small, rough structures built by primitive hands. They were enormous, deliberate architectural works, created by a people with vision, organization, and ambition. The center of the city was the Greater Pyramid, the largest of the monumental structures of Corral. It was more than 137 meters in length and rose almost 18 meters above the desert floor. An engineering feat on par with the first wonders of the ancient world. Built with stone, mud, and sacks of woven reeds filled with rocks, the pyramid was designed not only to withstand the harsh climate, but also to resist the devastating earthquakes that occasionally shook the region. And it endured, remaining in silence before the wind and the passage of time for almost 5 millennia. But the pyramids of Carroll were not tombs. Unlike the enormous funerary complexes of Egypt, the pyramids of Carroll had a different purpose. They were centers of ceremonies, power, and public life. Temples and meeting spaces crowned their summits, accessible by wide, elegant stairs. At the top of these platforms, bonfires once burned, and rituals were celebrated under the infinite Peruvian sky. At the feet of the pyramids, vast plazas opened, sunken and circular, inviting thousands of people to gather to celebrate religious ceremonies, political meetings, and community parties. The very design of Carroll's urban landscape suggested a society that valued community and order, a people deeply connected among themselves and with the cosmos. Around the pyramids, smaller residential complexes extended, probably home to priests, administrators, artisans, and farmers. The pyramids seem to have been placed strategically, aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, and the cycles of the stars. For the inhabitants of Corral, architecture was not only practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. Nowadays, when walking between the eroded stones, it is almost impossible not to feel a strange sense of awe. These structures were raised without metal tools, without the wheel, without beasts of burden. However, they were erected with symmetry, scale, and astonishing precision. The Great Pyramids of Corral were not built for vanity or for war. They were built to connect the earth and the sky, the community and the cosmos, humanity and eternity. And still they whisper through the sands, telling a story that refuses to be forgotten. Between the ruins of Corral, there is something deeply different, something that distinguishes it from so many ancient civilizations. No weapons have been found buried beneath its sands. There are no defensive walls that surround its plazas. There are no mass graves that offer clues of bloody conquests or internal struggles. Unlike the kingdoms that rose and fell because of war, Carroll was a society built on peace. It is a revelation that defies expectations. Here, a civilization existed that flourished not through violence, but through cooperation, commerce, and shared beliefs. The people of Corral seem to have invested their energy not in armies or fortresses, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and community life. Their plazas and pyramids were not monuments to victory over enemies. They were centers of celebration, worship, and government. This was a civilization that chose to meet instead of conquering, to negotiate instead of destroying. Commerce was the engine of Carroll's success. The cotton cultivated along the fertile banks of the river was spun to manufacture fishing nets that were exchanged with coastal communities. In exchange, Carroll received dried fish, an essential source of proteins, and exotic products from distant places like colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even uncommon tropical fruits from distant valleys. This wide commercial network united the region, linking remote communities in a peaceful network of mutual benefit. And in the center of it all, Carroll prospered as a cultural and economic center. The religious and ceremonial life played a fundamental role in maintaining social harmony. The great public spaces and the sunken plazas of the city probably served as a stage for rituals that united people under common spiritual beliefs. Music filled these meetings. Flutes carved from condor bones and drums made with deer skins created soundscapes that resonated in the desert, linking individual lives to something bigger. The leadership also seemed to depend less on the military force and more on the spiritual authority and the civic organization. The leaders of the city had to coordinate construction projects at a large scale, seasonal agricultural cycles, and complex commercial agreements. All of it without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often defined by conflict, Corral stands as a brilliant exception, a reminder that civilization does not have to arise on the bones of the conquered. Instead, it can be built thanks to the quiet power of collaboration, creativity, and trust. In Carroll, the stones still seem to resonate with echoes of a world disappeared a long time ago. It was not only a city of buildings and commerce. It was a city full of sound, ceremonies, and spiritual rhythm. The music and rituals were interwoven in the very heart of Carroll civilization. The archaeologists carefully excavated through the dry sands and discovered a treasure trove of ancient instruments, flutes carved in bones of condors and pelicans, whistles made with deer horns, and small drums tensed with animal skins. These artifacts were not simple toys. They were elaborated with care and tuned with specific notes designed so the sound reached the wide squares of the city. In a world without written language, music was the language of soul. Imagine the low hum of drums at sunset, the flutes sounding like the desert wind, the feet stomping in the sunken squares while hundreds of people gathered under the light of sunset. The bonfires crackled atop the pyramidal platforms. The priests, dressed in intricate woven tunics, sang to the gods of the river, earth, and stars. In those moments, Cairo was not just a city. It was a symphony. The layout of Corral suggests that ritual life was its core. The great squares were not mere open spaces. They were stages for community ceremonies, carefully designed to unite people. The sunken circular courtyards acted as ancient amphitheaters, concentrating the sound and the sight in the rituals that were celebrated in its center. And above them rose the pyramids, not as tombs, but as sacred mountains built by human hands that united earth with sky. The rituals probably marked the change of seasons, the cycles of sowing and harvest, and the movements of the stars. Music was not only entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, and between the known and the mysteries beyond. There were no violent murals, terrifying war gods, or bloody sacrifices. In Corral, the spiritual world seems to have been one of harmony, reverence, and celebration. Even today, when the desert wind whistles among the ruins, you can almost hear it. The faint chords of ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people that found beauty, meaning, and connection in the heart of the harsh, infinite sands. Cairo was not only a place of music, commerce, and rituals. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in one of Earth's most inhospitable landscapes. Without metal tools, the wheel, or draft animals, the inhabitants of Cairo built a city of stone and earth that has lasted almost 5,000 years. Their achievements were amazing. On the desert floor, gigantic pyramids rose, built not with small and fragile bricks, but with enormous stones transported through the dry valley. The workers transported the rocks using cane bags, ingenious baskets resistant enough to support heavy loads, woven with the same plants that grew along the riverbanks. They built carefully, layer after layer, stacking stones and filling the interior with debris to create structures that could resist not only the passage of time, but also nature's fury. And they knew nature well. Corral is located in a region prone to violent earthquakes. However, its pyramids and squares survived virtually intact. How? Mastering anti-seismic architecture. The builders used flexible construction techniques, layered fillings, wide foundations, and rounded corners that allowed their monuments to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. It was an engineering that was not born from textbooks, but from deep knowledge of the earth itself. Water management was another quiet triumph. Despite living in a desert, the inhabitants of Cairo developed sophisticated irrigation systems. Channels and ditches carefully led water from the rivers to their agricultural fields, which allowed the crops to flourish even during dry seasons. No water was wasted. Every drop was important. The very layout of Corral reflected brilliant urban planning. The main structures were aligned with key astronomical points, suggesting deep knowledge of solar cycles. The sunken squares, with their precise geometry, were more than just meeting places. They were instruments to observe the skies, which allowed the priests and astronomers to predict the seasons crucial for survival. Even the city's organization spoke of a complex society. The residential zones, the administrative areas, and the ceremonial centers were arranged in harmony, balancing the community life with the sacred spaces. They did not build only for the moment, but for future generations. Nowadays, while the modern engineers marvel at the resistance of Corral, they remember that the greatness is not measured only by the technology. Sometimes the deepest wisdom resides in understanding nature's forces, in working with the land, not against it. The stones of Cairo have withstood storms, earthquakes, and the erosion of time. They stand as a silent testimony to a civilization that built its dreams in the desert sands. For centuries, the city of Cairo flourished, a beacon of peace, music, commerce, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. And then, silently, almost without a trace, it was abandoned. No fire marked its fall. No sign of conquest marks its walls. No mass grave or shattered monument tells the story of a sudden disaster. Instead, Carroll simply faded away. Its squares were emptied. Its pyramids were abandoned to the shifting sands. Its flutes and drums silenced by time. Why did they leave? That question still lingers like a ghost through the Soup Valley. Some scholars believe that environmental change was the definitive blow. The test suggests that a long period of drought could have paralyzed the agriculture of Corral. Without the vivifying waters of the river, the fields would have withered. The commercial networks that depended on the surplus of cotton and food would have faltered. The delicate balance that Carroll had maintained with its harsh environment could have finally reached a point of no return. Other theories point to changes in commercial routes. As the neighboring cultures grew and new centers of power emerged along the coast and the interior, the influence of Carroll may have diminished. Perhaps the products that they previously supplied, such as cotton, fish, and agricultural products, were no longer enough to maintain their role as a dominant city. Little by little, the vital blood of commerce was depleted. Others whisper that there was internal decline. Without written records, we can only imagine political struggles, religious agitation, or simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure when survival becomes uncertain. Whatever the cause, the departure seems to have been gradual, not sudden. It is likely that families left one by one in search of more fertile valleys, rivers with more flow, new beginnings. The children who once ran through the squares of Carroll grew up telling stories of a lost city behind them, stories that with time would become legends. The desert recovered what humans had built. The winds carried fine sand over the stone temples. The flutes were buried under the shifting dunes. What once was a bustling and vibrant civilization became a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For almost 4,000 years, Carroll remained hidden, a whisper under the sands, waiting. Today, while archaeologists carefully uncover its stones, the question remains burning. How can a city so advanced, so beautifully built, simply disappear? Perhaps the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, however wise or peaceful they may be, are still fragile, threads woven into the tapestry of time, always vulnerable to the invisible forces of change. For millennia, Carroll remained forgotten, buried under the silent sands of the Soup Valley. Travelers passed through the strange, rounded hills that dotted the landscape, without suspecting that under their feet were the ruins of a civilization older than the pyramids of Egypt. For them, they were only natural formations, mounds shaped by the wind and time. It was not until the end of the 20th century that the world heard Carroll's voice again. In the decade of the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team to the Soup Valley, driven by curiosity and the growing sensation that these hills could hide secrets that nobody had yet discovered. What they found would rewrite the history of human civilization in America. Layer by layer, the sand was carefully removed. Underneath appeared walls of carefully carved stone, large stairs, sunken squares, pyramids, a city much older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the incredible discovery. Corral was more than 4,600 years old and had prospered at the same time as the first civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was a discovery that shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed that civilization in America had developed much later, in the shadow of the Old World's great empires. Corral changed everything. It demonstrated that America had given rise to a monumental architecture, a complex urban life, and a social organization independently long before the emergence of the Incas or the Maya. Ruth Shady and her team found not only stones and rubble, but remains of life. Musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipu, ancient records of knots, and even offerings to the gods. Each artifact told the story of a people who had built a society with vision, intelligence, and profound creativity. The rediscovery of Corral was more than an academic triumph. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept under the desert for thousands of years was now revealed once more under the open sky. its plazas kissed by the same winds that at another time had carried the sounds of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Corral is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, a fragile and valuable link with humanity's first dreams of building, belonging, and believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones resisted, waiting for someone to listen, see, and remember them. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that the roots of civilization extend far beyond what we believed. Between its pyramids and plazas, the ancient stones whisper a story that redefines our understanding of humanity's journey. A story not of conquest and bloodshed, but of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the imposing empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without the wheel. They charted the stars without written records. They created a prosperous society based on commerce, music, rituals, and engineering, all without leaving traces of war on the land. In an era often defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision of what civilization can be. A society that valued connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It reminds us that complexity does not require violence. That greatness is not measured by the number of armies that march across a battlefield, but by how a community comes together to build, create, and dream. The legacy of Corral goes far beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges the old assumptions that civilization had a single cradle, that urban life and monumental architecture belonged first to the ancient world. Corral demonstrates that the spirit of innovation and aspiration of humanity emerged independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desires to endure, celebrate, and reach the divine. Today, as we walk among the worn ruins of Corral, we can almost hear the beat of the drums, the hum of the flutes, the murmur of the merchants haggling in the plazas, the laughter of children running through the stone alleys under a sky of infinite stars. Their lives, their dreams, their stories remain with us, engraved in the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that, even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure. Asleep under the sand, waiting to be remembered, waiting to inspire again. In the great timeline of human history, Corral shines not only as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. A reminder that even in the most inhospitable deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.